Hello and welcome to the second video of Section 5, creating the Windows 7 virtual desktop machine image. To build the desktop there are several steps to complete as we discussed in the overview of this section, and in this video we're going to complete the first part of the build process. First we will build the virtual machine, configuring the virtual hardware to reflect the fact that the desktop is running as a VM. As we said, this also includes configuring the virtual machine BIOS settings. Once these steps have been completed, we can then move on and install the guest operating system, and in this example that's Windows 7, before installing VMware Tools software to ensure that we are running the correct VMware drivers and tools required for a virtual desktop machine. There are a number of different ways you can build a desktop OS. If you take a physical desktop environment, there are a number of ways in which the operating system can be built and deployed. For example, you could use the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit MDT, or maybe the Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager SCCM. Both of these options can be used along with all the other tools available to build desktop images. So we just talked about a couple of options that you can use to build your desktop images. But let's just highlight the one that you should not use. And that's a physical to virtual tool, or P2V, which turns a physical image into a virtual one. Best practice is to build a new virtual desktop image from scratch, so it starts off life as being designed to be a virtual machine from day one. After all, you would potentially build a new image for a new hardware platform, and that's essentially what you're going to be doing. There are a few reasons for not using your physical image to create your virtual desktop from. One of the reasons is the size of the image, which more than likely will have become bloated with numerous patches and updates being applied over the last years. You want your VDI image to be lean and fresh with just the most recent and relevant software installed. Another reason is that there might be some hardware drivers or other hardware-based software elements within the image, such as a desktop hardware management solution such as IAMT from Intel, that relies on firmware and other components that are built into the chipset of the physical machine. As you are now using a virtual desktop machine, this type of hardware is not always present, and therefore you don't require it to be installed. Before we get on with the build process itself, we need to look at the specifications of the virtual desktop machine from a hardware perspective, and what we need to configure it. For our example lab virtual desktop machine, we're going to configure it with 2 virtual CPUs. A single CPU may be sufficient for lighter workloads, but this is where your assessment data will tell you the answer to that question. The network card should be configured to use the VMware VMXNet3 network driver. We should have 4 GB of memory, and we need to ensure that the SCSI controller is set to LSI Logic SAS, but leave the hard disk size as the default size. There is no need to configure the graphics card, as any settings here will be overridden by the desktop pool settings later on. The optical drive should be set to client device so that you are able to mount ISO images to the virtual desktop machine to install software. The diskette drive should be set to disabled in the virtual machine BIOS, as should the parallel and serial ports. Another important factor when configuring the size of the hardware is not to fall into the trap of oversizing your virtual desktop machines. For example, if you only need 1 CPU, then only give the virtual desktop machine 1 CPU. Again, this is where your assessment data is critical. So now we're going to create our first virtual desktop machine image, and this first image will be using the Windows 7 operating system. To do this, we're going to use vCenter, and so we've already logged into our vSphere client, as you can see here, and we will use this to create our virtual machine image. So from here, we're just going to our VMs and templates section. Here we can see our data center. Across to actions, from the drop down option there, we're going to go for new virtual machine, and then we'll see the new virtual machine configuration screen. And the first option is select a creation type. So we have the options here to pick what type of virtual machine we're going to create. And in this instance, it's going to be a new virtual machine. So we select that and click next to continue. And then we see the select a name and folder screen. So we need to give the machine a name. So we're going to call this Windows 7 Gold Image, just to reflect what this virtual machine is all about. Then we need to select the location, so it's going to go in our PVO data center, and we click next to continue. So now we need to select a compute resource, so where is this machine going to be hosted, what's going to run it. So from our data center, we're going to expand our cluster and pick our host with 131 as its IP address. Next to continue. And then we move on to the select storage screen. So this is where we are going to choose the data store for where the virtual machine disk files are going to live. We can see here we have the VMware storage policy, so we can go for a default, encryption, vSAN or virtual volumes. We're going to go for the data store default, we're going to choose this second data store here, our VM data store, to save this virtual machine to. So we check compatibility check succeeded, and then we go next to continue. Now we need to choose the compatibility level. So what virtual machine hardware version is this machine going to be running? And from the drop down here we have several options. So we can go back as far as ESX 3.5 all the way up to ESX 6.5 and later, and also workstation 12 if we want to use this machine on a workstation. So you see there, if we go for ESX 6.5, this virtual machine uses hardware version 13, and that's compatible with ESX 6.5. Just watch out for this one. Some virtual machine hardware features are unavailable with this option. So make sure that if there's any hardware that you want in this particular virtual machine, you pick the appropriate hardware version. So obviously some of the newer versions will support newer hardware options and the older ones will not. When you're happy you've got the right version, click next to continue. And now we see the select a guest OS. So this is where we're going to choose what the operating system for our virtual desktop is going to be. And in the first drop down, the guest OS family, we're going to choose Windows because we're going to build a Windows machine. And then from the guest OS version, we're going to select the appropriate operating system. So in this instance, Windows 7 64-bit. Make sure you get the operating system correct because this determines which version of VMware Tools is going to be installed. Click next to continue. And now we have our customized hardware configuration screen. So this is where we can change the hardware configuration of our virtual desktop machine. So for our machine, we're going to change the CPUs to 2. We'll leave the memory at 2 gig. New hard drive 32 gig. Ensure that the SCSI controller is LSI Logic SAS. And then we get to new network. So first of all, we can choose which network to connect to. So in this instance, it's going to connect to our VM network. We could change that if we had other additional networks in our environment. What we want to do is expand the new network option, and we need to change the adapter type from E1000 to VMXNet3 because that's more performant. So we want a better network adapter. So once we've done that, the next task is to attach the installation media. So obviously we need to boot from that and install the OS from the beginning. So from new CD DVD drive, expand the arrow, and then from the drop down options where it says client device, we need to choose where the ISO image is. So we could connect to a client device, we could connect to a host device, or in this instance we're going to go for a data store ISO file. So we've copied the ISO files onto our data store, and the final option there we could have gone for content library ISO file. So we're going to select data store ISO file, and that will automatically pop up the select file or the vSphere Explorer window for us to go find that particular ISO file. So the ISO file image type is selected in file type. So we know we've put this in our data store 1. It's in that folder there. So if we expand that, we see our ISO images. So we click on there, we see we've got one for Windows 10, and the one that we want for this particular install is our Windows 7. Click to highlight. It'll just give you some information about that, the file name, etc. Click OK. So now we've selected our data store ISO file and which particular file it is, which pops into our CD DVD media there. The most important thing is to click and check the button for connect at power on. Otherwise, we don't connect the device, it won't boot, and we won't load the operating system. The other options here, we have video card options. At this stage, there's no point making any changes there because any desktop tool settings will override the video card settings. And then we can add some additional hardware if you wanted to add some new devices that you know this particular machine's having, maybe another hard drive, a second hard drive, maybe another network adapter or some other form of hardware. Maybe it's an NVIDIA card. So that's our hardware configuration. While we're in the customized hardware section, there's one other thing we need to do, and that's our VM options. So we need to scroll down to our boot options, expand the option for firmware, scroll down until we find Force BIOS Setup, and then check the box. What this means is when the machine boots the next time, it's going to force entry straight into the BIOS screen because we need to make some changes on the BIOS to reflect the fact that this is a virtual machine, not a physical one, So we need to turn some bits and pieces off that would potentially cause us some performance issues. It's easier to do that here. Otherwise, you need to try and press the appropriate key to get the machine into the BIOS, and you'll try that 10 times and fail because it boots too quickly. So once we've done that, next to continue, and then we land on our summary screen, or the ready to complete screen. So this just summarizes what we have just configured. So our provisioning type, we're going to create a new virtual machine. It's going to be called Windows 7 Gold Image, and it's going to be located in the folder PVO Data Center, run on host 131 in the VM data store. It's going to be Windows 7 64-bit. It's going to have 2 CPUs, 2 gig, 1 NIC. That NIC's connected to the VM network, and it's using the VMXNet3 driver. We have LSI Logic SAS as our hard disk controller. We've created a new 32 gig virtual disk, and we've stored that in our VM data store. And then we have our VM storage policy, virtual device node, and the mode of that disk. So once you're happy with all of that, we can click Finish. And that virtual machine will now be built. As you can see, it's appeared in our inventory view on our vCenter server, on our vSphere client screen. So the next task that we need to do is power on that particular virtual machine. So from the actions, drop down, power, power on. We'll now see that that's popped up. The screen has changed there as it's powered on. We also see the warning here, VMware Tools is not installed. That's because we've not actually installed an operating system yet. We'll come back to that once the operating system is up and running. So the next thing is we will launch a remote console to that machine. You'll see a pop-up here about the launch console. If you haven't installed VMRC or the virtual machine remote console, you can do that there by clicking download remote console. Then that will download the files. You can install it, and then it will run quite happily. So that's what we see now. So here we have the machine booted. We've connected a console to it. So now we can go ahead and configure the BIOS of this machine. As you can see, it's just a normal BIOS. So we can scroll through. And what we need to do is, first of all, is if we click or press the right arrow, the cursor key on the keyboard, and scroll down, so the arrow down key to I/O device configuration. So we went across to advanced, down to I/O configuration, press return. And now we see our I/O device configuration. So first is serial port set to auto. If we press return on that, we have some options, auto enabled and disabled. Press the arrow up to disabled, press return. Do the same for serial port B, so arrow down, serial port B, return, up, up, disabled. Same for the parallel port, disabled, and same for the floppy disk controller, disabled. The reason we do this, they don't exist in a virtual machine world. And what happens, particularly with things like floppy disks, the machine is continually having a look saying, have you put a floppy drive in? No, we haven't, because there's no such thing. There's no floppy drive. So therefore, we want to stop the machine from generating unwanted requests and generating unwanted traffic. So once we've done that, it's an F10 for save and exit. Set up confirmation and save configuration changes and exit now. Yes. We'll go back out to the BIOS. The machine will reboot because we've been into the BIOS. It'll save the settings you see there. And then what will happen is we will see it mount the ISO file. And then once that file's mounted, the Windows installation will start. So you see there, starting Windows. So this is just the standard Windows 7 installation. So what you need to do now is go through your standard installation, build the image as you want it, join it to a domain, sort out IP addressing, sort out any other updates. Don't forget to make sure it's patched and updated so it's completely up to date, because don't forget this is going to be your gold image, the image that everybody gets and logs into. So build it that it's in a state for everybody to use. And then once it's built, we'll come back and install our VMware tools. So now the installation of Windows 7 is complete. And here we can see that the machine is already built, ready to go. The only thing is it's not connected to a network yet, and that's purely because we've not yet installed the VMXNet driver that is part of VMware Tools. Remember, we changed that from the standard E1000. The E1000 would install, but we've changed the driver, which is now part of VMware Tools. So to do that, if we go back to our vSphere client, we can see the machine here powered on in the background. So what we need to do is click the option here for Install VMware Tools. And now we see the box pop up that says Install VMware Tools, and it tells us that it's going to improve graphics, mouse, networking, storage, etc. And what it's going to do is mount the VMware Tools installation media as a CD/DVD drive onto this particular machine. So when we press the Mount button, that's what it's going to do. So then if we switch back to the virtual desktop machine, we will see that the Windows popped up that says DVD drive VMware Tools run setup 64.8. Now that we've built the image for Windows 7 and our Windows 7 virtual desktop machine, the next step is to optimize it so that it runs as a virtual desktop machine.